The easiest lie to believe is the one wrapped in a badge. Just after sunrise, the city was waking beneath a pale gray sky as commuters filled the streets with the familiar rhythm of another ordinary weekday. Traffic lights blinked through the cool morning air, while courthouse employees hurried toward the stone building that had watched over downtown for nearly a century. Everything looked routine, predictable, and safe. But only a few blocks away, inside an unmarked police cruiser parked beneath the shadow of an aging parking garage, Officer Daniel Brooks glanced at his partner, Ryan Mitchell, with the confidence of a man who believed no one would ever question his version of the truth. Resting between them was a plain black duffel bag that looked unremarkable to anyone passing by, yet both officers understood exactly why it mattered. Their voices stayed low as they watched a silver SUV pull into a nearby parking lot. The driver stepped out calmly, carrying a leather briefcase and a paper cup of coffee, completely unaware that two pairs of eyes were following her every move. She wore a navy business suit, comfortable walking shoes, and simple pearl earrings that reflected the soft morning light. Her posture was confident but unassuming, the kind of person people noticed only long enough to forget a moment later. Her name was Naomi Carter. To Daniel and Ryan, she was nothing more than the perfect stranger. Someone respectable enough that no one would suspect she had been chosen simply because she looked like an easy target. Ryan checked the parking lot once more before quietly opening the cruiser door. The early morning breeze carried the distant sound of church bells and city buses as he crossed the pavement without attracting attention. Naomi disappeared into a neighborhood bakery across the street, leaving her vehicle unattended for only a few minutes. That was all the opportunity they believed they needed. Ryan moved quickly but never appeared rushed, opening the rear hatch just long enough to slip the duffel bag inside before closing it with practiced precision. No alarms sounded. No witnesses shouted. No one seemed to notice. By the time Naomi walked back toward her SUV carrying a warm breakfast sandwich and fresh coffee, Ryan was already seated beside Daniel, as though neither officer had left the patrol car. Daniel leaned back with a satisfied grin. "She'll never see it coming," he murmured. Ryan nodded, watching Naomi drive away toward the county courthouse. "Neither will the judge," he replied with quiet amusement. Miles ahead, Naomi continued her drive through the morning traffic without the slightest hint of anxiety. She listened to a local public radio station discussing community programs while sunlight reflected across her windshield. She stopped to allow an elderly veteran to cross the street, smiling politely before continuing downtown. There was nothing hurried about her movements. Nothing suggested fear. Nothing suggested guilt. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who believed that honesty eventually speaks louder than accusation. Neither officer considered that possibility. Instead, they radioed dispatch with a carefully rehearsed report describing an anonymous tip about suspicious cargo inside a silver SUV matching Naomi's license plate. Within minutes, additional patrol units began moving into position, unaware they had become pieces in a story already written by someone else. Daniel adjusted his uniform, glanced once more toward the courthouse rising above the city skyline, and smiled with absolute certainty that by lunchtime another headline would reinforce every assumption people were ready to believe. He had no idea that before another sunrise, he would walk into that same courthouse, hear the words, "All rise," lift his eyes toward the bench, and discover that the woman he believed he had framed was the very person who would decide whether justice still meant anything at all. Naomi Carter guided her silver sport utility vehicle through the crowded streets with the same steady patience she brought to every part of her life. She noticed the familiar coffee shop owners opening their doors, construction crews preparing for another long day, and school buses collecting children along quiet neighborhoods. To anyone watching, she was simply another professional heading to work before the city reached its busiest hour. She preferred it that way. Recognition had never interested her as much as responsibility. Her phone remained on silent inside her leather briefcase while the morning news discussed rising concerns about organized smuggling operations moving through the region. Naomi listened without changing her expression. She had spent years believing that the law could only remain strong when people trusted it more than the individuals who enforced it. Across town, Daniel Brooks and Ryan Mitchell exchanged confident smiles after hearing confirmation from dispatch that additional officers had accepted the anonymous report without hesitation. Their carefully prepared story was unfolding exactly as planned. Daniel adjusted the microphone attached to his uniform before speaking in a calm, measured voice that concealed every trace of excitement. He described a credible public safety concern and requested permission to conduct an investigative vehicle stop. No one questioned his report. His reputation for confident field work had earned him trust that morning, and he intended to use every bit of it. A few minutes later, Naomi noticed flashing patrol lights appearing behind her in the rearview mirror. She calmly activated her turn signal and guided her vehicle into a public parking area beside a government office, where several pedestrians were walking toward nearby businesses. She lowered her window before either officer reached her door. "Good morning, officers. Is there a problem?" she asked with quiet professionalism. Daniel greeted her with a polite smile that looked convincing enough for anyone observing from a distance. He explained that they had received information regarding possible illegal property connected to her vehicle and asked whether she would cooperate with a routine inspection. Naomi looked directly at him without displaying anger or fear. "Of course, officer. If there has been some misunderstanding, I am sure we can resolve it," she replied. Her composure unsettled Ryan far more than resistance would have. He had expected nervous questions or emotional reactions. Instead, she calmly stepped aside and waited while both officers approached the rear of her vehicle. Curious onlookers gradually slowed their pace. A delivery driver paused beside his truck. A young woman carrying groceries quietly watched from across the sidewalk. Even before the rear hatch opened, Daniel could already imagine the report he would later submit. Ryan lifted the hatch with deliberate confidence and reached toward the black duffel bag resting exactly where he had placed it earlier that morning. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Daniel looked toward Naomi with carefully rehearsed disappointment rather than surprise. "Ma'am, would you please explain why this package is inside your vehicle?" he asked. Naomi studied the unfamiliar bag without taking a single step forward. She did not rush to defend herself. She did not accuse anyone. She simply answered in the same calm voice she had used since the beginning. "I have never seen that bag before today. If you believe it belongs to me, then I trust the complete investigation will reveal the truth." Daniel briefly laughed beneath his breath, convinced those words would soon sound meaningless inside a courtroom. What neither officer noticed was the security camera mounted above the entrance to the government building quietly recording every movement from the moment the patrol cars arrived until the instant the rear hatch opened. While the growing crowd focused on the unexpected discovery, the silent camera continued capturing details that no rehearsed report would ever be able to erase. The questions began almost immediately. A middle-aged man standing near the sidewalk quietly asked another witness whether anyone had actually seen the bag inside the vehicle before the officers opened the rear hatch. A young woman holding a shopping bag looked uncertain as she replayed the scene in her mind, remembering that the silver sport utility vehicle had been unattended for only a few minutes while its owner stepped into the bakery. Yet the confidence in Officer Daniel Brooks's voice discouraged anyone from speaking too quickly. His badge carried an authority that many people instinctively trusted. Ryan Mitchell carefully removed the black duffel bag and placed it on the hood of a patrol vehicle while another officer documented the scene with a department-issued camera. Every movement appeared methodical, professional, and familiar. To passing drivers, it looked like another successful police investigation unfolding exactly as it should. Naomi Carter remained quietly beside her vehicle with her hands folded in front of her, watching every detail without interruption. She did not protest when Daniel explained that the contents of the bag would require additional investigation. She did not argue when he informed her that the vehicle would need to be processed according to department procedures. Instead, she calmly looked from one officer to another before asking a single question. "Officer, has anyone reviewed every available security camera before reaching this conclusion?" Daniel answered almost instantly. "That will be handled during the investigation." Naomi nodded politely. "I certainly hope it will." Something about her response lingered in Ryan's mind. Most people placed under public suspicion reacted with frustration, confusion, or desperation. Naomi displayed none of those emotions. Her expression reflected patience rather than panic. as though she understood that time often revealed details people overlooked in the heat of the moment. Nearby, the manager of the government office stepped outside after hearing the commotion. He briefly glanced toward the security camera mounted above the entrance before returning inside, without saying a word. The camera continued recording silently, unnoticed by nearly everyone gathered there. A few minutes later, Daniel handed Naomi a copy of the incident paperwork and explained the next procedural steps with polished professionalism. Several bystanders quietly recorded the encounter on their cellular phones, uploading short clips before the scene had even concluded. Within minutes, comments began spreading across local community pages. Some assumed the officers had prevented serious criminal activity. Others questioned how quickly the investigation seemed to have reached its conclusions. Naomi accepted the paperwork, thanked the officers for explaining the process, and gathered her briefcase from the front passenger seat after receiving permission to do so. She neither pleaded nor attempted to persuade anyone standing nearby. As she closed the vehicle door, she looked directly at Daniel with steady eyes that revealed neither anger nor fear. "The truth has a way of arriving exactly when it is needed," she said softly. Daniel answered with a confident smile that barely concealed his satisfaction. "That is what court is for." Naomi simply inclined her head before leaving the parking area in another government vehicle arranged through courthouse administration. Daniel watched her disappear into the morning traffic, convinced the hardest part of his plan was already behind him. He never noticed that across the street, the bakery owner had quietly saved surveillance footage from the front entrance after realizing its cameras faced directly toward the parking lot where Naomi's vehicle had been left unattended. While Daniel believed the evidence pointed only one direction, silent witnesses made of glass lenses and digital memory had been preserving a far more complete story, waiting for the moment when every second would finally matter. By early afternoon, the story had already escaped the parking lot and taken on a life of its own. Short video clips spread across local social media pages, each one showing only fragments of what had happened. People debated the images without knowing the full sequence of events. Some praised the officers for acting quickly. Others questioned why the woman in the business suit had remained so calm from beginning to end. Inside the county courthouse, employees moved through marble hallways beneath tall windows that filled the building with soft afternoon light. Clerks organized case files while attorneys reviewed legal briefs in quiet conference rooms. The familiar sound of polished shoes echoed across the floors, blending with distant conversations and the occasional closing of heavy wooden doors. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary, yet beneath that calm routine an invisible clock continued moving toward a moment no one expected. Naomi Carter entered the building through a private employee entrance carrying the same leather briefcase she had held all morning. Several courthouse staff members greeted her warmly, but she politely excused herself from casual conversation, explaining that she needed time to review documents before the next day's docket. Her voice remained steady, revealing nothing about the unusual events that had unfolded only hours earlier. In her office, neatly arranged case files covered one side of a large oak desk, while a framed copy of the Constitution rested beside shelves filled with legal volumes. Naomi quietly removed a small notebook from her briefcase and carefully recorded the timeline exactly as she remembered it. She wrote the time she entered the bakery, the location of every patrol vehicle, the names displayed on the officers' uniforms, and the positions of nearby security cameras. She added no emotional commentary, only facts. Years on the bench had taught her that truth became strongest when supported by careful detail rather than outrage. Across town, Daniel Brooks and Ryan Mitchell completed their reports with growing confidence. Every sentence reinforced the same narrative: anonymous information, lawful investigation, suspicious discovery, professional conduct. They congratulated each other on how smoothly the morning had unfolded. Ryan even joked that the paperwork would probably take longer than the investigation itself. Neither man realized that digital evidence does not become less accurate simply because it is ignored. While they finalized their reports, the Courthouse Information Technology Department automatically archived security recordings from every public entrance, including the exact time Naomi arrived for work after leaving the traffic stop. At nearly the same moment, The bakery owner responded to a routine request from an insurance provider by downloading surveillance footage from the front of the store before the system automatically recycled its memory. Without realizing it, ordinary people performing ordinary tasks were preserving extraordinary evidence. As daylight slowly faded beyond the courthouse windows, Naomi looked once toward the courtroom scheduled for the following morning. The polished wooden bench stood empty beneath the state seal, waiting in complete silence. She gathered her files, switched off the office lights, and quietly closed the door behind her. Somewhere else in the city, Daniel confidently prepared his uniform for another day, believing he would soon testify without difficulty before whatever judge happened to receive the case. He never imagined that fate had already placed every piece exactly where it belonged, and that the courtroom he expected to control with confident testimony was quietly preparing to reveal a truth that could not be rehearsed, rewritten, or hidden behind any report. The next morning arrived with the quiet confidence that only a courthouse could carry. Before sunrise had fully lifted above the city skyline, attorneys reviewed their notes beneath soft desk lamps. Deputies greeted one another in measured voices, and clerks rolled carts filled with neatly organized case files through polished hallways. Naomi Carter entered the building several minutes earlier than usual, greeting every employee with the same calm smile she offered each morning. Nothing about her demeanor suggested that she had spent the previous day at the center of an accusation spreading across local news and social media. She walked through the familiar corridors without rushing, carrying only her leather briefcase and a slim folder containing handwritten notes. Inside her chambers, she carefully reviewed the day's schedule. Several routine hearings would take place before the afternoon session. Near the bottom of the docket rested a case connected to the incident involving the suspicious package discovered inside her vehicle. Naomi studied the paperwork without changing her expression. She quietly compared the incident report with the timeline she had recorded the previous afternoon. Small details immediately caught her attention. The reported sequence of events did not perfectly match the timestamps she remembered. Rather than reaching conclusions, she simply placed colored markers beside several entries before closing the file. Across town, Daniel Brooks and Ryan Mitchell prepared for court with complete confidence. Daniel adjusted his tie while joking that the hearing would probably last less than an hour because the evidence appeared straightforward. Ryan laughed and replied that careful paperwork usually defeated uncomfortable questions long before they reached a courtroom. Neither officer showed the slightest concern as they drove toward the courthouse beneath clear blue skies. To them, the entire situation had already become another routine assignment destined to disappear into a filing cabinet. Meanwhile, several unnoticed events continued unfolding beyond their awareness. The Courthouse Information Technology Office completed its overnight backup of surveillance recordings without interruption. The bakery owner answered a request from a local investigator asking whether exterior cameras had been operating during business hours the previous morning. A maintenance supervisor confirmed that the government building security system had remained fully functional throughout the entire week. None of these people believed they were participating in anything extraordinary. They simply performed ordinary responsibilities with professional care. Shortly before the morning calendar began, Naomi paused beside the large courtroom windows overlooking the courthouse plaza. Dozens of people crossed the square below, each carrying private concerns invisible to everyone else. She reflected for a moment on something her father had often told her when she was a young law student. Truth rarely arrives with the loudest voice. Most of the time, it simply waits until every distraction grows quiet enough for people to finally hear it. She softly repeated those words to herself before placing the handwritten notebook back inside her briefcase. Outside the courtroom, Daniel and Ryan passed through courthouse security with relaxed expressions, exchanging polite greetings with employees who recognized them from previous proceedings. They glanced briefly toward the courtroom assignment board before following directions to the scheduled hearing. Everything looked exactly as they expected. The marble floors reflected the morning sunlight. The American flag stood motionless beside the courtroom doors. Attorneys organized legal folders while spectators slowly filled the public gallery. Daniel straightened his uniform one final time, convinced that another ordinary appearance before another ordinary judge was only minutes away. He never noticed that behind a closed wooden door nearby, A neatly folded black judicial robe rested beside Naomi Carter's desk, waiting for the precise moment when every assumption made during the past 24 hours would begin to unravel with nothing more than the quiet opening of a courtroom door. The hallway outside courtroom 4 grew quieter as the scheduled hearing approached. Conversations that had filled the corridor only minutes earlier faded into respectful whispers, while attorneys gathered their files and court staff completed final preparations. Daniel Brooks glanced at the courtroom clock and smiled with quiet confidence. Everything appeared to be unfolding exactly as he had expected. The incident report had been filed. The evidence log had been completed. Every document rested neatly inside the official case folder. Ryan Mitchell leaned against the wall with the relaxed posture of someone who believed the difficult part was already over. "This should be simple," he said softly. "The paperwork speaks for itself." Daniel nodded without hesitation. "Facts always win," he replied, convinced that the version of events written in the report would become the version everyone accepted. A few feet away, several attorneys exchanged polite greetings with courthouse employees while members of the public slowly entered the gallery. Some recognized Daniel and Ryan from previous appearances and offered courteous smiles. Others quietly discussed the widely shared videos from the previous day, wondering whether the hearing might answer questions that social media never could. Inside her chambers, Naomi Carter stood before a full-length mirror as an assistant placed several case folders in perfect order across her desk. The familiar black judicial robe hung neatly beside the bookshelf, waiting for another ordinary day of service. Naomi reviewed the docket one final time before opening the handwritten notebook she had carried since the traffic stop. She carefully compared each recorded time with the official incident report. Again, the differences remained small but impossible to ignore. The dispatch request, the timing of the vehicle search, the sequence described by the officers. Individually, they seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern that deserved careful examination rather than quick conclusions. Naomi quietly closed the notebook and placed it beside the official file. Her responsibility was not to defend herself or accuse anyone. Her responsibility was to protect the integrity of the courtroom by allowing verified facts to speak louder than assumptions. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the building, a courthouse technology specialist completed a routine request to preserve all surveillance recordings connected to the previous day's activity after receiving a standard evidence retention notice. At nearly the same time, an investigator collected digital copies of exterior security footage from nearby businesses, following normal procedure whenever public recordings might become relevant to an ongoing matter. None of these actions attracted attention because they happened every week inside a busy courthouse. Yet each ordinary step quietly strengthened a timeline that no one in the hallway could see. Daniel adjusted the collar of his uniform and glanced toward the courtroom doors as a deputy announced that proceedings would begin in only a few minutes. Ryan straightened his jacket and gathered the evidence binder with calm assurance. Neither officer showed the slightest hint of concern. They believed they understood every important detail before the hearing had even started. Then the courtroom doors slowly opened. Spectators found their seats. Attorneys organized their notes. The deputy stepped forward with practiced composure and prepared to begin the session. Daniel took one final confident breath before crossing the threshold, never imagining that within moments the room itself would challenge every assumption he had carried inside. Somewhere beyond the closed door leading from the judicial chambers, measured footsteps echoed across polished wood, steady, deliberate, and unhurried, drawing closer with every passing second as the courtroom waited in complete silence for the judge to take the bench. The deputy stepped to the center of the courtroom and spoke with calm authority. "All rise." Every conversation ended instantly. Chairs moved quietly across the polished floor as attorneys, court staff, spectators, and the two officers stood together beneath the seal of justice. Daniel Brooks straightened his uniform with complete confidence, his attention fixed on the empty bench ahead. Ryan Mitchell held the evidence binder comfortably against his side, expecting another routine proceeding before another unfamiliar judge. Then the side door opened. A figure wearing a black judicial robe entered with measured steps that echoed softly through the silent courtroom. Daniel looked up for only a brief moment before his expression froze. Ryan's confident posture disappeared just as quickly. Neither man spoke. Neither man moved. Standing before them was Naomi Carter. The same woman they had confidently accused less than 24 hours earlier now walked with quiet dignity toward the highest seat in the room. She neither glanced at them with anger nor acknowledged the surprise spreading across their faces. She simply took her place behind the bench, arranged the case files before her, and waited until everyone had resumed their seats. The silence that followed felt heavier than any spoken accusation. Around the courtroom, several attorneys exchanged puzzled glances after recognizing the sudden change in the officer's expressions. A court reporter adjusted the machine in front of her, sensing an unusual tension that had not existed only moments before. The courtroom clerk began calling the morning calendar with practiced precision, while Naomi listened attentively to each matter exactly as she did every day. Her voice remained steady, respectful, and completely professional. Anyone entering the courtroom at that moment would have seen only an experienced judge carrying out ordinary responsibilities. Daniel could barely concentrate on the words being spoken. Questions rushed through his mind faster than he could answer them. How had they never known who she was? Why had she never identified herself during the traffic stop? Ryan quietly opened the evidence binder, pretending to review documents while avoiding eye contact with the bench. The confidence they had carried into the courthouse only minutes earlier had quietly dissolved into uncertainty. Naomi finally reached the case connected to the previous day's incident. Without changing her calm expression, she reviewed the file for several moments before looking toward counsel. Before this court proceeds, I have reviewed the preliminary filings and have identified several factual questions that require clarification, she said evenly. Accuracy is essential in every proceeding, particularly when the reputation of any citizen is involved. Her words contained no accusation, no frustration, only the careful reminder that every person deserved a fair examination of the facts. She then requested confirmation that all available evidence had been preserved, including surveillance recordings, dispatch records, and any digital documentation connected to the investigation. Daniel felt the confidence leave his face completely. Those requests sounded routine to everyone else in the courtroom, but he understood exactly what they meant. The hearing was no longer resting only on written reports. Every recorded moment now mattered. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly to the documents before her and made several handwritten notes with deliberate care. She looked back toward the courtroom with the same composed professionalism she had shown from the very beginning. This court will examine every relevant piece of evidence before reaching any conclusion, she said. That obligation belongs equally to every person who enters this room. For the first time since the previous morning, Daniel realized that the greatest mistake had not been underestimating the woman standing before him. It had been assuming that truth could be limited to the version written inside a single report when an entire courtroom existed for the purpose of discovering everything that report might have left behind. The courtroom settled into complete silence as the first pieces of evidence began moving from written claims to verified records. Naomi Carter reviewed the filings one final time before looking toward counsel with the calm expression that had never changed since the hearing began. This court is interested only in facts that can be confirmed, she said evenly. Opinions may differ. Evidence does not. At her instruction, the clerk admitted the official dispatch log into the record. The timestamps appeared routine until they were compared with the officer's written report. A quiet murmur spread across the gallery as attorneys noticed that several recorded times did not perfectly match the sequence described in the incident narrative. Daniel Brooks shifted slightly in his seat while Ryan Mitchell kept his eyes fixed on the documents before him. The differences were measured in minutes. Yet those minutes suddenly carried enormous significance. Naomi made no comment beyond asking that the comparison remain part of the official record. Next came the exterior security footage collected from the government building across the street. The video displayed a wide view of the parking area from the previous morning. Although the recording contained no dramatic confrontation, it quietly documented the movement of every vehicle and every person entering or leaving the lot. The courtroom watched as Naomi's sport utility vehicle remained parked while she entered the bakery. Moments later, another figure crossed the lot, paused beside the rear of her vehicle, and returned toward the location where the unmarked police cruiser had been waiting. No one spoke while the recording played. The silence itself became more powerful than any argument. Naomi requested that the playback stop at several specific timestamps before asking that the footage from the bakery be displayed as well. That recording showed a different angle of the same parking lot. Together, the two cameras created a nearly continuous timeline of the morning. Neither recording relied on memory. Neither recording relied on personal interpretation. They simply preserved events exactly as they occurred. The courtroom remained focused as the final video ended. Naomi looked toward counsel without raising her voice. The purpose of evidence is not to embarrass anyone, she said calmly. Its purpose is to establish truth. She then directed attention to the body camera records listed in the evidence inventory. The technology specialist explained that the files had been preserved according to standard departmental policy. When portions of the recordings were reviewed alongside the surveillance footage and dispatch records, the overall timeline became increasingly consistent. Individual pieces that had once appeared unrelated now aligned with remarkable precision. Attorneys quietly highlighted passages inside their notebooks, while spectators exchanged thoughtful glances instead of whispered speculation. Daniel felt every page inside the evidence binder becoming heavier with each passing minute. Ryan no longer attempted to project confidence. Neither officer interrupted the proceedings because every question asked by the court was supported by a corresponding document, timestamp, or recording. Naomi maintained the same measured tone throughout the hearing, allowing every verified fact to enter the record without unnecessary commentary. When the final exhibit had been marked, she closed the case file gently and folded her hands upon the bench. A courtroom does not exist to confirm assumptions, she said. It exists to examine the complete record before reaching any conclusion. Those words settled over the room with quiet authority. For the first time since the hearing had begun, everyone present understood that the outcome would not depend upon reputation, uniforms, public opinion, or first impressions. It would depend entirely upon the patient accumulation of facts that had been waiting all along for someone willing to examine them with equal care and without prejudice. The final exhibit was placed into the official record, and the courtroom fell into a silence so complete that even the faint sound of pages turning seemed unusually loud. Judge Naomi Carter looked across the room with the same composed expression she had carried from the moment she entered the bench. There was no satisfaction in her face, no anger, and no desire to embarrass anyone standing before the court. She simply understood that justice demanded patience before judgment. After carefully reviewing the admitted evidence, she folded her hands and spoke with quiet clarity. The complete record presented today demonstrates that significant factual inconsistencies require further independent review before any finding can be considered reliable. This court cannot ignore verified evidence simply because an earlier narrative appeared convincing. Every word echoed through the courtroom with measured authority. The attorneys nodded as they reviewed their notes, recognizing that the surveillance recordings, dispatch records, and preserved digital evidence had created a timeline that could not be dismissed. Naomi continued, "Our legal system depends upon careful examination rather than assumption. Every citizen deserves equal protection under the law, regardless of appearance, profession, or public opinion." Daniel Brooks lowered his eyes toward the table in front of him. Only 24 hours earlier, he had believed that confidence alone would carry his version of events beyond question. Now he understood that confidence without truth could not survive inside a courtroom built to examine facts. Ryan Mitchell remained silent beside him, realizing that every overlooked detail had eventually found its place within the complete record. The courtroom was no longer focused on personalities. It was focused on accountability. Naomi ordered that the matter be referred for appropriate independent review according to established legal procedures and that all preserved evidence remain secured for continued examination. Her decision reflected process rather than emotion, reinforcing the principle that fairness belongs to every person who enters a courtroom. No raised voices followed. No dramatic celebration interrupted the proceedings. Instead, the outcome carried a different kind of weight, the quiet realization that integrity is often restored through careful diligence rather than spectacle. As spectators slowly left the gallery, conversations sounded different from those heard before the hearing began. People no longer discussed rumors or short video clips circulating online. They spoke about evidence, responsibility, and the importance of waiting until every fact had been examined before reaching conclusions. Several young law students lingered in the hallway, reflecting on what they had witnessed. One professor quietly remarked that today's lesson had been more valuable than any lecture because it demonstrated that justice requires humility from everyone involved. Naomi returned to her chambers after the session ended, removed her judicial robe, and carefully placed it where it belonged. She paused briefly beside the window, overlooking the courthouse steps as people continued with their ordinary lives below. The city looked unchanged, yet she knew that every honest decision made inside a courtroom helped strengthen public trust one case at a time. Before leaving for the evening, she closed the same notebook she had begun after the traffic stop. The final page contained only one sentence written neatly across the bottom. Facts do not compete with prejudice. They outlast it. She switched off the office light, closed the door quietly behind her, and walked down the empty hallway as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the courthouse windows. The building settled into silence once again, leaving behind a reminder that badges, titles, and assumptions may influence first impressions, but only truth has the patience to stand unchanged until justice is finally ready to listen.